Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on developing a landlord network. My name is Gale Schwartz. I am with the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania and work out of our Pittsburgh office. This webinar marks the first in a special HAPPN webinar series. For those who are unfamiliar, HAPPN is the Homeless Action and PA Providers Network, a long-standing initiative of the Housing Alliance working to prevent and end homelessness in Pennsylvania. The issue of developing a landlord network and landlord engagement generally has been a very popular topic at our Homes Within Reach conference. And I would like to take this opportunity to remind everybody on the call today, on the webinar today, that our RFP for workshop proposals have gone out this week. So if you know of anything interesting happening or have been doing something really, really unique with landlord engagement or in any other aspect of housing, please be sure to submit a workshop proposal. Those proposals are due Monday, April 2nd. Now let's get to the meat of why we are all on this webinar today, creating a landlord network. Joining me in discussing this topic, we have Anita Zuberi from Duquesne University, as well as Chuck Keenan from the Allegheny County Department of Human Services. So as I said, I am with the Housing Alliance. For the past couple of years now, I have been working with the folks on the ground here in Allegheny County, helping to cultivate a landlord network. This initiative really started a couple of years ago as the continuum of care here locally was looking to retool their transitional housing programs to rapid rehousing. And in order for these programs to be really, really successful, are people able to hear me?
I can hear you on the phone. It looks like there's some people that can't hear that are through the audio controls on their computer, though. Should we tell them to call in?
Yes. Let me do that number real quick. Sorry for the technical difficulties for the folks on the call. Hold on one second. I am just sending the audio call-in number to folks. Great, so I've just sent that around and we'll get back to the presentation. So I've been working with the folks on the ground here in Allegheny County as they were retooling their transitional housing programs to rapid rehousing. Again, this is a program model that really requires having a large pool of landlords with ready units that are within a certain price range and, of course, up to a certain quality. And this was, somewhat of a challenge in our local community, especially as we've seen challenges in the rental market. And we also know that for the Public Housing Authority here as well, they were having some challenges as well. And so we've all been working together to see how can we create a large community-wide pool so that low-income residents who are working with these programs can access safe, decent, affordable housing in communities of choice. So when developing our landlord engagement strategy, we really sort of had three goals. We wanted to identify better ways to engage landlords so that we could have that pipeline and really make sure that landlords were willing to make exceptions for people with high barriers to housing. We really wanted to understand what was happening in our local market. Now, you know, some of the recommendations that are going to come out of today's presentation, I do want to make a note. They're not always going to address the predatory actors that may be on either the landlord or the tenant side, but really we approached our work about making sure that we had better connections between service providers and landlords. And then really our last goal was to be really thoughtful in identifying the opportunities to make the business argument versus a charitable argument. That we wanted to make sure that we understood where landlords were coming from. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Chuck Keenan from the Allegheny County Department of Human Services.
Okay, thanks, Gale. I hope everyone can hear me. So my name is Chuck Keenan. I work at the Allegheny County Department of Human Services, which is where Pittsburgh is located. We serve about 200,000 people a year, maybe a little over 200,000 in any given year, out of a population of about 1.2 million in the county, so about 1/5 to 1/6 of the residents in Allegheny County receive our services. We have a budget of over $800 million currently and a number of different program offices. Basically, I think we like to say that we work cradle to grave or womb to tomb with people who have disabilities or who are aging or who are involved with the child welfare system, just a whole host of clients that we serve in a given year. And a good bit of those folks have housing issues, so I'm going to talk about what we've been doing to try to work on those. So I think what we've been seeing nationally is reflected in what's also going on locally in Allegheny County. So I know there's a move away from facility-based programs to more tenant-based programs to get people out into the communities. So we've had a number of large institutions close. We've had public housing communities close or demolish units. We've had transitional housing programs convert to rapid rehousing, and a lot of mixed income communities developed with really with less affordable units and more market rate units in them. So the impact of that has really been a lot of vouchers or rental subsidies that are out on the street. So government agencies really don't want to own property that much anymore. We'd really like to partner with landlords in the community. So there's been kind of a movement in that direction as well. As Gale said, there's been a lot of turnback of vouchers, especially in our city, and this really forced us to look at partnerships, and then also incentives to make those partnerships work. So kind of all that has created a really tight landlord market. So vacancy rates are really low. Rents are going up somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5%. I think it's maybe slowed down a little bit, but so rents are really rising a lot faster than inflation is. So people's income is not being able to buy as much of an apartment as it used to. We've also seen federal subsidies reduced and diminishing resources for constructing and maintaining affordable housing. So that's really kind of resulted in the loss of affordable housing in our community, and I think in a lot of communities across the country. So it's really kind of split the market in a couple different directions. We've had a lot of hot markets where it's really difficult to find apartments for people, especially if you have a subsidy or a voucher. And the rents might even be too high to use those vouchers in. So it's really difficult to access those kind of hot markets that may have been weak markets in the past but have really kind of improved. have a lot of investment in them, and consequently the rents are going up and some people are being displaced. We also have some weak markets where there's not a lot of investment in them. Owners really don't have any money to do any maintenance on them, and unfortunately that's where the rents are low, but it's also where the housing quality is low, and oftentimes people can't pass inspections, so it makes kind of partnering in some of these weak markets difficult. But that's really where the resources are for us to access. And then tight markets, are just difficult as well to work in, where there's not a lot of incentive or ways for folks to work together. So it's kind of a graphic depiction, I think, of what we're seeing, at least in Allegheny County, and I think it's kind of reflected nationally. There's a lot more tenant-based rental assistance in the market now, so the supply of project-based rental assistance and low-income public housing and other really communities or projects is decreasing, and there's a lot more tenant-based rental assistance in the market to make up for that loss. There's also a big increase in the luxury and market rate communities, so we're seeing a lot of high-end development, but not much being done on the low end, on the affordable side. And it's also making the naturally occurring affordable housing close as well. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing, at least mostly throughout the country. Gale's going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing in Allegheny County to address some of these things, and what her research and Dr. Zuberi's research has found. Do you want to do any kind of questions now, or should we just move on?
I don't think we have any questions yet, so
okay.
We'll go ahead and move on.
Okay.
So when we started our work, I think one of the things that we really wanted to do was understand what was happening in our market locally. We did lots of landlord outreach. Allegheny County is somewhat fortunate in that we have some very, very well-organized, large landlord associations that have regular meetings, and so we were able to interact with a lot of landlords very, very quickly and sort of efficiently. And in those conversations, and then also starting to look at some of our local data, we really started to understand that essentially in Allegheny County, and really across the nation, it's a landlord's market. There is a really, really high demand for rental housing, and the higher the demand, the pickier they can be. We also started to look at what was happening in our stock, and so we see that more and more rentals are not in sort of the large multifamily buildings or tenements. We're seeing rentals in structures that are 4 units or less. We also saw, as a result of the recession, a huge number of single-family home rentals came online, most likely from real estate investors buying up homes that had gone into foreclosure as a result of the crisis. And then looking at our housing stock here specifically, 80% of it was built before 1979. So it's old. We have a huge lead problem. Some of the code enforcement in recent years has not been very, very thorough. So there's oftentimes in lower end rentals some very creative repairs that have been made that probably are not up to code. And then we also did a lot of research in, really what is the best practice in making sure that you have a good pipeline of ready and available units to work with tenant-based subsidy programs such as housing choice vouchers and the rapid rehousing program. And really it's to engage the small to mid-sized landlords. Oftentimes they are, the actual owners of the properties that you are trying to get folks into, and that makes them more flexible than bigger developers and bigger companies. So what we saw is that in our research, a lot of low to moderate income renters in the private market really do live in those units that are in structures that are 4 units or less. That we're seeing single family homes are really accounting for a lot of the growth in the rental stock overall nationally. That, you know, the ownership of these types of structures really is fragmented. There's a lot of individual owners, and that sort of makes it hard to understand what's happening with this piece of the market. And so, you know, with all of our research and all of our conversations, you know, just in working with landlords, and we also hosted a couple of landlord forums, really what we learned is that our landlords locally knew that programs were out there to help people, but they don't really understand exactly what they're supposed to do, or even how to connect with them. For those landlords who were already working with a program, they were likely to be working with multiple programs, which was really interesting because oftentimes, you know, when we talk to case managers and people who are out helping clients find apartments, they have their personal list of landlords. They did not want to share that list because they, you know, didn't want to risk somebody else burning their bridge. But what we were hearing is that landlords were doing business with multiple programs anyway. Landlords really trust each other. They want to hear from other landlords. They like to listen to what other landlords, so getting a landlord testimonial and seal of approval is really, really powerful. Locally, we found that they are very social, so whenever we had any sort of landlord event and information session, we always made sure to give ample time for networking just so people could talk to each other, build relationships, and just felt safe in a no-pressure environment to ask questions about programs. Landlords are really, really good at spreading the word. They, whether it's good or bad, if they have a really great experience, they do share that. If they have a bad experience, they do share that as well, and they are more likely to share the bad experience more often. We do know that landlords are willing to compromise when they feel supported. And then the other thing that we learned is that, especially here locally in the greater Pittsburgh area, is that there's a real lack of resources to support this part of the market. And what we mean by that is, you know, there's no money out there to sort of help the little guy fix up his apartment to make sure that it's up to code, that it meets the housing quality standards. You know, you can find tons of resources for larger buildings, but definitely not for these smaller businesses. But we're also seeing that these smaller businesses is the vast majority of landlords that are working with the tenant-based subsidy programs like rapid rehousing and housing choice vouchers. So with that, we started to look at what are resources that can really, really help this piece of the market, and some of the models of incentives that can help improve relationships with the smaller landlords and help them improve the quality of their units is a risk mitigation fund. This is basically a pot of money that you can draw down on in the event that a tenant does damage a property. And by saying that you have this pot of money, sometimes it really overcomes that sort of stigma and barrier with landlords of, you know, if something happens, if they abandon the unit, if they damage my property, you know, I could go after them in court, but you can't get blood from a stone. So, you know, who's going to help make these repairs? And so that's what the risk mitigation fund can help do. We saw some communities provided what's called vacancy hold payments, especially with the Housing Choice Voucher Program. The inspection process takes some time, and really there's no reimbursement for that time that a landlord has to keep the unit empty. So that's foregone rental income just to work with this program. And especially in a high demand rental market, this really is a huge barrier for landlords to work with these programs. You know, they may want to help somebody, they may want to do some good, but if they have another tenant who isn't working with one of these programs and can move in right away with the unit as is, the realities of the business say that they have to do, they're going to take that tenant over your housing choice voucher tenant or rapid rehousing tenant. And then we also looked at, you know, models of repair rebates and repair loans and grants. And so we saw all of these great examples from other communities and decided that we wanted to do real focus groups with our landlords locally to see if these incentives would be good for our community here and for the rental market in Pittsburgh. And with that, we partnered with Anita Zuberi at Duquesne University because she was also doing some very interesting research with these smaller landlords that are working with low-income families. And so with that, I'm going to pass it on to Anita, and she can tell you about the good stuff she has going on.
Great. Thank you, Gale. I'm Anita Zuberi. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Duquesne University. As you can see on the slide, my research area is really focused on the intersection of poverty, neighborhoods, low-income families, and social policy. And I've been focusing a lot recently on housing and changes in housing policy that move families who were living in public housing into the private market with housing vouchers. And some of my previous work that I was involved in looking at the residents' experiences highlighted the importance of the landlord in shaping their experiences in the private market. And we don't, it turns out with looking into the research, we don't actually know that much about landlords except for what we hear in the media and a few very impactful studies like Evicted by Matthew Desmond that recently came out. So I was really interested in trying to understand the experiences of landlords who are working with lower income families as a way to really try and understand the way in which they were dealing with some of the problems and challenges that tend to be associated with populations living in poverty. So how are they dealing with issues of the low-wage job market or employment instability that then translate into having potentially problems paying rent, late rent, for example. And so that's kind of where I was at when I met Gale, and she was starting to do these focus groups of landlords around organizing them to work with human service agencies. So in this study, I have a couple of different components. One of them is doing in-depth interviews with landlords to try and understand their experiences, their challenges, and the strategies they're using to deal with some of these challenges. And I was able to partner with Gale to begin with the set of focus groups that we conducted in the fall of 2016. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the findings from those focus groups that speak to landlords' experiences and opinions about working with local human service agencies. So we conducted 4 different focus groups. We divided the landlords by the size of their portfolio. because, as Gale mentioned earlier, landlords with a smaller number of units may be very different in terms of their resources and ability to hold a unit vacant for inspections, et cetera, than a landlord that has 50 or more units. So you can see here the breakdown of the landlords in the focus groups, and I'll talk now about some of their experiences and opinions on working with local agencies. And I should say that not all of the landlords in the focus groups had worked with an agency, but those who did had experiences with working with refugees. I think Jewish Family Services had come up with that. Veterans, the Veterans Leadership Program was one, and parolees as well. And overall, people tended to have a good experience working with these different groups and these populations. So here you can see some quotes from landlords that I pulled out of the focus groups. With respect to working with refugees, one landlord said that she had had excellent luck, that refugees had been very good tenants, and she had a good experience working with the organization in terms of getting support. With respect to veterans, one landlord mentioned that, they really prioritize this group. So if you were on Section 8, we prefer to rent to veterans. In general, they prefer to rent to somebody who had what they called a legitimate issue, so somebody who might be mentally ill, that knowing that they are on that program and getting a support system was appealing for them. That same landlord also mentioned that, if somebody could work, they wanted to make sure that that person was working, and that if they weren't working, it was only because, again, they had a legitimate issue for not working. With respect to parolees, there was some interesting discussion in one of the focus groups where people were saying really positive things about working with parolees. One landlord noted that they knew that, they had to have a clean drug test. They had to be able to be, out so they're not committing crimes. They have to abide by certain guidelines. And then also they noted that the alternative, if they weren't renting a house from the landlord, is that they would be living in a much worse situation. So they tend to be quite thankful for their place as a tenant. I should also say that there was some mixed experiences with the parolees, which one landlord noted that if the parolee ends up going back to jail, the landlord often doesn't find out. And so the landlord might not find out until much later, so you have to be careful to make sure your water gets turned off, because if it's winter time, the pipes can freeze and burst. She also noted that in one instance, her the parolee who had been living there and went to jail owed somebody money, and so the person that they owed money had come to the house and stolen the dishwasher. So there were also still some issues and some bit of risk that you were taking with renting to this group, but overall they felt it was positive. So I kind of highlighted here some of the good experiences, the good features of working with human service providers that came up in the focus groups. The first one was about rent. Every landlord likes to be paid their rent, and they even like it more when they get paid early. So one landlord said, what I like about them, they pay the rent the month before. So on the 26th of the month, I'm getting the rent for, this was in September, so for October, which I think is great. Another landlord noted that one group they worked with paid the first 6 months of rent up front, and that was really great for them. Another positive was that the landlords really appreciated having a connection to a case manager for any potential issues that might arise. So this didn't mean necessarily multiple calls, once a week or something like that. One landlord noted they call me one time per month, and that was good enough for him. Other landlords spoke about having had a situation. One landlord mentioned that he was renting to a veteran who had been homeless for 6 months, had 2 wives, and moved into his home, and the veteran complained about the garage being too small for his bike. And so the landlord called the case manager. The case manager talked to the veteran, the client, solved everything, and then the landlord didn't have to do anything in that situation, and they were very appreciative of that. In another case, a landlord had, this was from one of my interviews, not from the focus group, but a landlord had been renting to somebody who had mental health issues. Things were clearly starting to go in a negative direction, and the case manager intervened and worked to get that tenant out of the unit. So that was positive as well. The last point I wanted to talk about for the good things in terms of working with an organization was that tenants appreciated that the organization had done some level of screening before the person came to them. So this quote here is from a landlord talking about how they decided to do screening of tenants and whether it was different with these special populations. And she says, you know what, I do treat that differently because I know most of the organizations that I'm dealing with are dealing with people because they have issues. And so their backgrounds are going to look a little bit different. But I understand that they are in the program for a reason and they have achieved a certain level of success. So I'm much more forgiving on that. So this idea that the organization can provide not only some sense of stability, some sense of support, and also a certain level of screening, these ideas were all very appealing for working with a human service agency to a landlord. Of course, there were some bad things that came out too. Landlords found it challenging when problems happened outside of the working hours of the human service agency. So one landlord mentioned that a lot of problems happen after 9 to 5, after 5 o'clock and on the weekends is when everything goes wrong. And so he then said, you know, they help us, the organization, but at an administration level, and the people have these other needs. So the people who are homeless, they need a solution now, and the nonprofit organization is working with their set of timing. He clearly was a little bit bitter, which is timeless, they don't mind. But the idea that the office, the 9 to 5 sort of standard set of hours didn't always match when the landlord was having issues, and that was frustrating when they didn't feel like they could have that support when they needed it. The second point that came up was around the process of connecting units, so connecting the agency's need for a unit with the landlord's supply. And so the thing that was bothering some landlords here was that they felt it was a rather inefficient process. And so a lot of times a landlord would get phone calls from agencies who needed a place in downtown or some specific area, and they didn't have a unit available. But one landlord mentioned, I always have these units available in a building in Penn Hills, but you know, nobody wants them, and so that was felt to be inefficient. One of the landlords that worked with parolees said that she always asked them if they'll advertise her apartment at their facility, but that agency makes sure that the parolees are looking for themselves so that they can go anywhere they want. And so, again, it was like this inefficient process where if there was some way to centralize the needs of the agencies so that the landlord could then go to this place and be able to match their supply, that would be much better than kind of constantly getting phone calls and not being able, having these missed connections, right, not being able to really make the match. So a couple of main themes that came out of these focus groups, I think, are that having a support person for the landlord is key. So one landlord said, there's a go-between that say, like, if somebody has a mental illness or something like that and they're on Social Security and disability, you can call their caseworker and be like, I think there's a problem. You need to send somebody to check it out. And then I think that would be very beneficial to some other people that would qualify for the low-income housing to have that extra level of go-between. So I think the feature that the human service agencies have that really makes them valuable and potentially even more appealing than working with, say, a standard Section 8 housing voucher is that you can have this extra support person. And a landlord from my in-depth interviews mentioned that when the person is there and they're able to be responsive, then that's when the program worked well for them. When there were other situations when that person was not there and was not helpful, when the person was having mental health issues, that's when they had a really big nightmare situation. They ended up calling 312 on that person. And the last point here, the main theme is that the landlord also wants to be able to retain some level of flexibility or control over their unit. So this landlord stated, I want to have control over my tenants, right? So if you work with an agency and you get a tenant in there and you're finding 3 months into it that it's not working, then I want the ability to say, you know what? You need to find them somewhere else to live. I'm not going to do this anymore. I want to be able to have the flexibility to cut the cord when I feel that my property is not being taken care of. And this came up not just with one landlord, but with other landlords as well. So in particular, in a situation where the agency might pay rent up front, if the landlord then wants to evict this person, they don't actually have very many grounds for the eviction, so it makes it much more difficult to get this person out of their unit. And so that was one also important consideration to take away. And this final slide about the focus group is just one that an issue I think that came up a lot, and some takeaway points is that when we think about landlords, we often think about how they're portrayed in the media. We often think about the slumlord stereotype. And what we found in talking to landlords is that there seems to be just as much stigma around landlords as there are around lower income tenants. And that there were landlords who were willing and interested to be engaged in working with human service providers to house people. This point here about many landlords want to do good while still doing well. So that financial bottom line still matters, but they did enjoy being part of the process of helping somebody out. And that being a landlord is an opportunity for people with barriers themselves. Some of the landlords we talked to had lost a lot of retirement savings when in the post-9/11 crash, and they were doing this as a way to invest in their future. They didn't really fit what we typically think about as, full-time owning thousands of properties and having no investment in their community. They were actually really invested in their properties, invested in their communities. Some of them had nice relationships with their tenants, which I think looks very different than what we often think of. And then also noting that landlords are people, especially these smaller scale ones, and they can fall on hard times too. So we have to be cognizant of how much we're asking them to do in thinking about things like vacancy holds and potential repairs that they may have to deal with after having a tenant. And the final point is just that what came out in talking to landlords in the focus groups and also in my interviews was that landlords really want to be viewed as a partner in the process. And more than just in, words, but also in terms of the actual process of helping to house an individual. So they may be able to notify somebody of an issue that may be arising with their tenant, and it would be helpful for them to have somebody to call to deal with. These landlords are not social workers, they're not trained social workers. We don't want them to be taking on the role of a trained social worker, but being able to be a partner in this process where they have access to a good set of services would be very important for them in terms of working with these groups. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chuck Keenan.
So I'm going to take this opportunity to refer to some of the questions that have been typed in. The first one is from Candace. Hi, I would like to know how does a housing administrator find connection to focus groups involving landlords? I think with us, we really just sort of made our own focus groups. We engaged with the landlords and gave them opportunity to sign up and hosted our own. Anita and I worked together in developing a discussion guide. We can definitely distribute that discussion guide with the PowerPoint slides today after the webinar is over, and anybody is welcome to call me and talk out some strategies in how you can organize your own focus groups with landlords. And then another quick question from Heather. When you were speaking regarding focus groups, bad information, could you please state again what the issue concerning the inefficiencies were?
Sorry, can you say that one more time? I missed it.
When you were speaking regarding focus groups, the bad information, could you talk again real quickly about what landlords meant by inefficiencies of the process?
Oh, sure. This is really about connecting the agency and so the agency often needs a unit in a specific area, and the landlord has a set of units available, only a set of units available at a given time. So this is really about timing and information sharing, and it became frustrating when a landlord would receive calls from multiple agencies asking for units in different areas. The landlord doesn't have units in those areas, has units in other areas, but the agencies aren't interested. So you can imagine that being called by an agency to connect with a, to provide a unit if you have one available is great, but when you're constantly being, told that, oh, that's not what I want, that's not in the place that I want, it becomes a little bit annoying, and also it's just very inefficient. So the landlord was suggesting that if there was a way to somehow make the process more efficient so that they wouldn't receive multiple calls from agencies, needing places that were not what they had available. I hope that clarifies things.
Great. Our next question comes from Kathy, and she asked, how did you identify the landlords? And what we did is we sort of had a kickoff event with this initiative is we did a landlord forum, and we had folks pre-register for the event online, and so we got their emails, and between those who signed in and gave us their contact information for this forum and also registered ahead of time, we ended up getting a list of about 150 emails, and from that we were able to send out information about the focus groups, and that's how they signed up. The next question I think is a perfect segue into what Chuck is going to talk about, and it is from Pamela. She asked, where could the funds come from for the repair mitigation program suggestion?
Okay, so why don't I talk about that one next. So we started a landlord risk mitigation fund about 6 months ago in Allegheny County. It was based off of kind of what everybody's been talking about so far, which is that landlords talk to each other, that this is all based on relationships, and that if something goes wrong, they're going to need to be made whole, and if they're not, they're probably not going to work with you again, and they're probably going to tell their friends, other landlords, about the program, and then there's a potential to lose those landlords as well. So we started this Landlord Risk Mitigation Fund. It's $50,000. We got it from the Fair Funds, the residential or the real estate transfer tax portion of that last year. And basically how it operates is that our partners, our service providers at DHS, who are out there pounding the pavement trying to find landlords and are oftentimes being rejected by those landlords because their clients have high barriers, can use this as a tool in their toolbox to incentivize the landlords to participate in the program. So as I said earlier, we serve a lot of people a year, 200,000. A lot of them have housing issues. They also have a lot of barriers like criminal histories, bad credit, previous evictions, all kinds of different things that make them not look too good on paper, especially for a landlord. So this was really our incentive to again, make the landlord whole if something goes wrong and give them an excuse to say yes to somebody rather than to always say no, which has been our experience in the past. So this kind of has had an opportunity to open up the pool of landlords for us. So it basically acts as insurance in case something goes wrong, and then as an incentive for the landlord to take on that additional risk. So that's one thing we've done. And then I also wanted to mention another project that we launched a year before this, which it's about 18 months ago. We started a partnership between us and Action Housing called the Housing Connector. It's basically designed to help people with disabilities find housing in a community of their choice, in the housing of their choice. So it's really a hands-on service, a concierge type service where we walk one-on-one with the client and also with the landlord. We've had to do in this project a lot of cold calling, internet searches, even begging to get landlords to participate. We've had a lot of clients who've had Section 8 vouchers who've lost those vouchers. So we've tried to help them get those vouchers back with the Housing Authority. We've had a lot of participants in the program not know how to do a housing search or even how to contact the landlord. So it's been really effective in doing that because we do really walk one-on-one through that process. And it also really has given the landlords a lot of peace of mind, kind of as we learn through the focus groups and others, that they need somebody else to talk to in case there's problems. So this has been able to fill that need too. So those are two things that we've done here in Allegheny County. I think we'd also like to do something about the repairs that are needed, but that's just not launched as of yet. So hopefully we can do something soon. So in terms of where we got money for the mitigation fund, for us it was the Fair Funds, but I think if you have a local housing trust fund or if you have an affordable housing fund or even a foundation, it might be a good project to start. So far we haven't used the fund yet. Nobody's made a claim against the mitigation fund. And hopefully if they do, we won't see a lot of them. Are there other questions too?
Yeah, there are some more questions that have been typed in from
Does it have a cap?
Recent?
Yes. Does the Landlord Mitigation Fund have a cap? I see Heather. So yeah, it's $3,000, and it also has to be, the claim has to be made within 3 years of the date that the client moves in. So we ask that there's an inspection up front. And the reason we did 3 years is we think that basically at that point the landlord has hopefully gotten enough rental income off of the program to mitigate the risk.
Okay, so we've had a couple of questions come in. One is from Kathy. Recently there was a story on NPR that talked about landlords not wanting to rent to veterans, likely due to concerns about PTSD. Did you run into any of those concerns? I know in our focus groups, Veterans actually was one of our more sort of sympathetic populations, and I think we've done very well engaging landlords to work with that population. Pittsburgh did recently declare an end to veterans homelessness. Chuck was involved in that initiative. Do you want to speak to anything that you did special with engaging landlords as part of that initiative?
No, I would definitely agree that of all the subpopulations that we work with, veterans seem to be the one that landlords are most willing to work with, and I think we've kind of used that experience to try to get them to open up to other populations as well that they might not have wanted to work with in the past. To say, look, this veteran is a lot like the other clients that we have, and I know you took a chance on them, so would you try somebody with a mental illness or somebody who's experienced homelessness? But yeah, I think the veterans piece has actually been kind of easier than our other subpopulation.
Okay, and our next question was, how did you advertise your interviews or focus groups? What enticed landlords to participate? With the focus groups, we had our own email distribution list. We also provide food. Food is really, really good in enticing landlords to participate, and also just the fact that we ask them to tell us about their experiences. One of the things that I heard from the president of one of the local landlord associations here said to me is, you are the first person to ever come to us and ask, what is it that we need, and what is it that we need, and why aren't we working with these programs already? That nobody had really sort of approached them in the way that we had approached them. And then I think, Anita, you also had some incentives that you used?
Yeah, when I did one-on-one in-depth interviews, they took about an hour and a half to 2 hours, and I did offer a gift card. I think it was, I want to say, $20 or $30 gift card to Home Depot, a home type improvement store. But I think what you were saying, Gale, was right. I had the same experience with the interviews. A local housing authority sent a letter on my behalf to all of its landlords, and I was contacted by over 150. And what people told me on the phone was that they thought I was asking the right questions and that nobody had asked them these questions before. So I think that, landlords are a pretty understudied population. They have a lot to say, and especially if you approach them in a way that you are not attacking them, they are quite open to talking about that information.
Our next question is from Kiva. Is there any housing programs in your area that has a 24-hour case management model? If so, how is it funded? Chuck?
Yes, so I think 24 hours is probably hard to say, but I think a lot of our case managers give their cell phone numbers to the landlords, and if there are problems that occur outside of business hours, that they will call. So I don't know that it's per se a 24-hour case management service, but I think our case managers and a lot of providers have on-call folks that can handle emergencies, if that's kind of what the question is.
Great. Our next question is, do any of the programs offer landlord financial business planning education to help them learn how much to save each month from each unit to plan for the future? So we definitely have looked into sort of landlord training, and we surveyed landlords on different topics. we passed out surveys we hosted 2 landlord forums a year apart that had about anywhere from 70 to 100 landlords attend. And so that sort of gave us a sense of what they were interested in. But the reality is that when we were talking to landlords with the focus groups, one of the most surprising things that I learned is that it really takes a large number of units in order to make a landlord business in Pittsburgh self-sustaining. So we had one person tell us it takes 20 units to make a landlord business self-sustaining, and even then it's still the best practice to have a second income just in case there's incidentals and overhead. So the reality is that for these, especially lower end, naturally affordable units that work with the rapid rehousing and housing choice voucher programs, is that they're operating on razor thin margins, and really the only way for them to increase the savings that they can earn off of each unit each month is to raise the rent, but then they would be above the payment standards that we need them to be in order to work with our programs. So there's definitely, through our local landlord associations, training classes offered that way, and we are looking at opportunities to develop trainings. But right now, at least locally, we don't have anything that's offered from our sector to the landlord network. Next question. Did you get a sense of any landlords wanting or not wanting to work with rapid rehousing programs? And are they willing to work with participants who do not have good credit history, et cetera, to keep them housed with the landlord at the end of the rapid rehousing support?
I can answer that.
Okay.
So I think, yes, there are some landlords that are not necessarily going to want to work with these types of programs. And, they tend to maybe be smaller scale landlords who have misinformation about who people are or just aren't really interested. But in terms of continuing to work with participants, I think the landlords really want long-term tenants. That was something that came out of the focus groups and interviews. And so, and most of the landlords that I talked to did not care about a good credit history. They know that so many people have credit issues that they didn't even bother with credit checks because they expected that.
Great.
I think a lot of times we just have to try to get them to say yes, and with whatever incentives we can. And not everybody wants to participate in these programs, but you have to keep going back to them and asking and saying, what can I do to change your mind, and will this work, and I'll be there too, and those kinds of things. So it's just constantly kind of selling the programs and selling the tenants.
Okay, so we have time for one last question. There are a few other questions that we're not going to be able to get to on the webinar today, but we will be able to type out answers and email them out along with the PowerPoint after today. So our last question is from Kathy. Are many of the landlords in Pittsburgh absentee landlords? Some of our properties are owned by people out of state or out of country and are managed by property management companies. And the answer is yes, we have lots of absentee landlords. For us, I think, again, going back to these landlord associations, these are in-person meetings. And so if we are meeting them at in-person meetings, then we know we are dealing with the real owner of the properties. Is there anything else that maybe you want to add, Chuck?
No, I mean, I think you just have to work with who's here locally as best you can.
All right. Well,
I think that there are absentee landlords, but there are also other landlords who are really invested. So like Chuck said, you just need to focus on those people and getting them engaged, and there's plenty of them to work with as well.
all right. With that, that concludes today's webinar on developing a landlord network. Thank you to everyone for getting on the webinar today. I do apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning. I again want to thank Chuck and Anita for presenting, and we will be sending out the PowerPoints, access to a recording of today's webinar, some other supporting materials. And please feel free to contact any one of us with questions as you start to develop your landlord networks in your communities. Thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.